Hello everybody and welcome back to Land Law. In this lesson we're moving on to the third chapter of our studies, focusing on this idea of registered title, the registered title system. In this lesson we'll take an introduction to the concept of registered land, as well as the implications of the existence of the land registry and some of the principles that exist on the land registry as well. So, this is a new topic, essentially, that we're going to introduce, the subject of registered title. The vast majority of you who end up becoming solicitors and working within this area of the law will probably be dealing with the principles and ideas of registered title. Given the fact that the vast majority of land that exists in England and Wales today is registered and is increasingly growing in terms of the amount of registered title that is, or at least the amount of title that is being registered as time goes on. So it's very important that we spend some time examining this in more detail. And so we'll look at some of the ideas relating to the subject of registered title, as well as the nature of the land register and some of the principles which are encoded by the land register. So, if we remember back to earlier lessons, there was one thing that we was talking about in relation to the purchase of unregistered title, unregistered land. This was this idea of the concept of unregistered conveyancing, but we also remember that there are usually two main considerations which ought to be made when we talk about the purchase of an estate. If I was the purchaser of title of an estate of some land, whether it be registered or whether it be unregistered, there are generally two questions that I'm going to ask. The first question is, who has good title? Does the person who I'm selling or buying the property from actually have title to be able to sell it to me? That's the first question. Who owns the property? Second question is, what legal and or equitable interests exist over said property, over that title? Now, if you remember back to the lessons when we looked at the unregistered land system, it was relatively difficult to answer some of these questions. So when it comes to the who owns what title, you would have to go through the history of title deeds, and you would have to essentially go back as far as 15 years to establish who has some kind of chain of connection in terms of chain of ownership. When it comes to what legal and equitable interest exist over the land for unregistered title, you have to rely on the doctrine of notice, you have to rely on the Land Charges Act, and you also have to rely on the process of overreaching, all of which we have covered in more detail in previous lessons. And so if you want to see those lessons, head over to the playlist that we have established. Well, the Land Registration Act intends to improve upon this particular issue and essentially tries to solidify something of a more substantial method by which we can understand the process of A, who owns the title, and B, who has the good legal or equitable interests over said title. So let's think about registered title then. The idea behind the legislation and the Land Registration Act is to create a central and reliable database for which individuals can find land, can find the owners of land, and may even be able to find interest which exists over the land. This is known as the Land Registry. Now, the Land Registry is a place that essentially has physical documentation of registered title, but you can also look on the Land Registry online nowadays. And the concept of the land registry is a centralized system by which an individual can find all reliable information pertaining to the ownership of and interest that exist over the land. So, given that this is the case, and given the fact that the purchase of land is legally and logistically complicated, and the fact that the land registry is has to be incredibly accurate and not have any kind of mistakes, owing to the legal and logistically complicated issues relating to the purchase of land, there are a number of principles which exist within the concept of registered land in the land registry that essentially tries to ensure that the land registry itself is very accurate. Okay, because if it wasn't particularly very accurate, then a mistake could potentially cause a buyer or seller to lose a lot of money, and so, or could potentially cause a buyer or seller to be bound to interests that they did not want to be bound to and wouldn't have purchased the title if they'd known otherwise. So let's have a look at what the foundational principles of the land registry are. There are three, the first being the mirror principle, the second being the curtain principle, and the third being the insurance principle. Beginning first then with the mirror principle. The idea of the mirror principle is this view that the land registry ought to properly reflect and accurately reflect reality. That is why it's called the mirror principle. It's supposed to mirror reality. This means that there ought not be a real need to go in and have to essentially do a lot of deep investigative examinations of registered title. One should and ought to be able to just simply look at the land registry itself and find the information they need relating to maybe who owns the title, as well as what kind of interest exists over the title. That's the idea. The land registry ought to properly reflect the basic ideas of who owns the property and who may have legal or equitable interest over said property. And you can have a look on the land registry if you go online, and you can type in the address of some property and it will give you the owner's name. It will also give you some of the interest which may exist over said property. Now, it doesn't give you all the interest that exists over all the property, and we will get to concepts of overriding interests, which are interests which override the land registry and override a registrable disposition, all of which we will get to in the future, but they are seen to be representative of what has sometimes been described as a crack in the mirror. And so we'll talk about this in more detail, but for the most part, the mirror principle is supposed to essentially allow the land registry to accurately reflect reality. In conjunction with the mirror principle, you have the concept of the curtain principle. This principle relates to the protection of certain pieces of confidential information. Let's say that there exists some property, and that this property is part of a trust which is held for some beneficiaries. The idea behind the curtain principle is that a purchaser does not need to look behind the curtain, i.e. does not need to go about and do a number of different pieces of investigations over such interest, and that these interests simply ought to just be overreachable at the point of purchase. And so the idea here is that where a situation exists where you have some kind of trust that could exist over the land for some beneficiary, a restriction will be entered into the register, which will then inform the potential purchaser that a certain amount of particular due process is required in order for the insurance of this interest to be overreached. We will get to what a restriction is in a future lesson's time. We'll get to the concept of notices and restrictions in more detail. But for now, just note that the curtain principle essentially allows for confidential interest to be protected and essentially just informs a purchaser of the process of overreaching which may be required. Finally, then, we have the insurance principle. Now, what the insurance principle tells us is that the interests and rights of people relying on the register are going to be protected by the state. So the idea behind the land register is to reflect reality insofar as it can, and to be an accurate reflection of what that kind of land looks like, and what that kind of land, who owns that kind of land, and what interest exists over that kind of land. Where there is some mistake in the land register, and this mistake brings about some loss to an individual, then the insurance principle tells us that the state ought to properly compensate that person. And what this does is it means that people are able to rely on the register for information, so there is trust in the land register, and it also means that the state is incentivized to take good care to ensure that the register is accurate.